Good evening. Good evening. I'm Pamela Eddington, the president of Dutchess Community College, and it's my honor to welcome you this evening to the inaugural event in the Dr. D. David Conklin Lecture Series. I'd like to start tonight by asking that everyone please silence their cell phones. So can we just take a moment to all take care of that together? I didn't even bring wine tonight to show you, so we take care. Okay, great. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening and for your support of Dutchess Community College. With the current and former members of the College Board of Trustees, as well as the Dutchess Community College Foundation Board, please stand to be recognized. So these are our Board of Trustees and our Foundation Board. Please stand. They do a tremendous service for the institution. A college president has the expectation of making a difference while holding the office. You know, I certainly do. But not every president is concerned about what happens when they leave their institution. I want to thank my predecessor, the fourth president of Dutchess Community College, Dr. D. David Conklin, for establishing this lecture series so that generations of students will benefit from the generosity of the donors who have supported this series through our DCC Foundation. David, would you please stand to be recognized along with the foundation donors this evening? Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. D. David Conklin, the fourth president of the college. Thank you, David. Guest speakers like Dr. Kennedy this evening and Dr. Alita Black, whose visit last week was also made possible by the foundation with support from the Handel Foundation endowed faculty chair to perpetuate the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, enhance the academic environment for our students. I'm especially pleased to see so many of our students in the audience, and I'm sure that we have our faculty to thank for your presence, but I also know for certain that you will benefit from being with us this evening. The historians, authors, scientists, artists, and other scholars we bring to campus enrich our academic community as well as the community at large. And I'm also happy to see so many community members with us this evening. Dr. Kennedy's visit was secured by Paul Sparrow, the director of the FDR Library. Paul assumed his role at the library shortly after I became president of the college, and he has become a good friend and collaborator with the college. Scholars come from all over the world to conduct research at the FDR Library, and we are fortunate to have this resource and Paul Sparrow in our neighborhood. Earlier today, Dr. Kennedy very generously conducted a master class for our faculty and local high school teachers at the library. Given the title of tonight's lecture, Franklin Roosevelt, A 20th Century Life, it seems to me that Paul Sparrow is the ideal person to introduce our guest speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Sparrow.
Thank you, President Eddington, and thank you, President Conklin, for sponsoring this inaugural lecture series. I agree that when you bring in people with great ideas, it elevates the audience. Franklin Roosevelt loved Dutchess County. He loved the Hudson Valley. He built his presidential library here for a very specific reason, which is that he wanted to attract the best and the brightest to come here to study his life, because he felt that they could only truly understand who he was as a man and as a leader if they came here to the Hudson Valley and saw the forces that influenced him. Now, I am in a crash course on Roosevelt right now. For the last 2.5 years, I've been reading every book I can get my hands on, and it's quite a task. There's probably about 1,800 books that have been written on FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, and there are certain books that really stand out. One of them is written by Dr. Kennedy, who is the Donald McLaughlin Emeritus Professor at Stanford University. And he said this earlier, and I had a little trouble believing him. He says he's been teaching at Stanford for 50 years, which is really quite extraordinary. I think about the impact he has had. Think of all the students that have gone through his classroom and whose lives he touched. It's really quite amazing. He's the editor of the Oxford History of the United States and of a textbook called American Pageant. I guess you're an editor of the American Pageant, right? He was won the Bancroft Prize of one of the 10 books that he's written. It was called Birth Control, The Career of Margaret Sanger. And then he was a Pulitzer finalist for a book called World War I Over Here. But then in 2000, he won the Pulitzer Prize for what I consider one of the greatest of all of the Roosevelt books. It's called Freedom from Fear, The American People in Depression and War. And it is truly a remarkable book. I was just telling you earlier, I read the book, and then I am currently re-listening to it again on audiobook. And it really provides a unique insight into not just the presidency or the timeline or the chronology of his administration, but it goes deeply into the American people during that period. It was an extraordinary period in American history. You cannot appreciate the depths of despair that the Depression caused in this country and the importance of having a leader who could come along and literally transform the country through his vision for a better future. You have to give Eleanor Roosevelt credit for as well. She was with him the whole time, often arguing with him, the conscience sitting on his shoulder. But I think the insights that Dr. Kennedy brings to this period are truly remarkable, and I hope you enjoy his lecture as much as I'm sure I will. Please welcome Dr. David Kennedy.
Thank you, Paul, for that generous introduction. Thank you, President Eddington, for making this event possible. And David Conklin, I want to say to you directly that it is a great honor for me to be the inaugural lecturer in this series named for you. And thanks to all of you for being here. I want to begin with a personal story that will strike many of you as having nothing to do with Franklin Roosevelt, but I want to extract a point of some more general relevance from it. I live in California, where you can do just about anything you want to do outdoors, about 362 days a year. And one of the things I like to do a lot is ride my bicycle. And there's a ride down the Big Sur coast of California. Those of you who've been there know what I'm talking about. It's a 100-mile ride from Carmel, California to Cambria, down at the south end of the Big Sur area. So I did this for the first time about a dozen years ago. And you have to imagine the scene as a bunch of middle-aged people in spandex milling around in the parking lot of a motel at Carmel and getting ready to go down the road at about 6 o'clock in the morning. And I had not been on this ride before, didn't know anybody, and this fellow came up and he introduced himself to me. And he said, I'm Jack McGlynn. I'm a lawyer in San Francisco. I haven't seen you on this ride before. Welcome. Glad to see you here. I said, oh, well, thanks, Jack. My name's David Kennedy, and I teach history at Stanford University. He said, oh, I know all about you guys. I said, what do you mean? He said, you historians. He said, all you do is you make up these what-if scenarios. What if this had happened? How would things be different? Or what if something hadn't happened? How would the course of history be different? And I thought, well, that's a pretty simplistic way to reduce my life's work to this proposition. But he said, before I could muster anything that even resembled a cogent answer, he said, well, I've got one for you. He said, what if on November 22nd, 1963, it had been not John F. Kennedy who fell to the assassin's bullet, but Nikita Khrushchev, who had been killed on that day? How would the subsequent course of history have been different? Well, as you might imagine, I'd never thought of that question before. And before I could muster anything that looked like a reasonable answer, he said, well, I'll tell you. Again, I should have seen it coming. He said, I'll tell you, we can say one thing with absolute certainty about the subsequent course of history, had it been Khrushchev and not Kennedy who was killed on that day. He said, I can tell you, sir, with 100% certainty, Aristotle Onassis would not have married Mrs. Khrushchev. Now, I detect a certain division of the House here. So, certain people get the joke. Others don't. If you needed proof that Humor is generationally specific. This story will illustrate it. If you don't carry around a mental picture of Mrs. Khrushchev, not to mention Jacqueline Kennedy, you don't get the joke. So when I tried to tell that story to my undergraduate students at Stanford, they look at me the way the young people in this room just looked at me just now, like, what are you talking about? Go Google some images and you'll see what I mean. All right, let me bring this story home a little bit, however, home to tonight's topic, and recollect too another date, not as famous in history as November 22nd, 1963, February 15th, 1933. Franklin Roosevelt is the president-elect of the United States. He's been elected the preceding November. At that time, presidents weren't inaugurated following their election until the March of the following year. Roosevelt's 1933 March inauguration was the last one in that sequence. We changed the law since then. But he was president-elect. He was getting some rest before he began his task as president. He was in Florida and motoring down the street in an open car. And he stopped to wave to the crowd. And the then mayor of Chicago, Anton Cermak, stepped out to greet him. And at that moment, a pistol barked, and Cermak was terribly wounded. Roosevelt's car sped off. Roosevelt told the driver to stop. Someone fetched Cermak, who was bleeding profusely. Roosevelt put him in the car with himself and took him to a hospital. To no avail, Cermak died. Now, what's the point of that story? The point is that if that would-be assassin had aimed just a degree or two otherwise, he would have hit not Anton Cermak, but Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt would have died before he ever had a chance to be inaugurated as President of the United States. It was that close. It was a matter of inches. Now, I'm going to tell you another personal story, and then we'll get to the heart of the matter here. Some years ago, I was teaching in England, and I had the great privilege of being introduced to Sir Isaiah Berlin, whose name will mean something to some of you in this room, very famous British philosopher and historian in the 20th century, and a really eminent personality, and I was very honored to be introduced to him. And he greeted me by saying, "Oh, you're the man who's writing this new biography of Franklin Roosevelt." And I said, "Well, no, actually, Sir Isaiah, I'm not writing a biography of Franklin Roosevelt. I'm writing a general history of the United States during the 1930s and 40s, and of course, he's a central figure in that story, but it's not a biography." I said, "But I'll tell you honestly, Sir Isaiah, it's a problem for me sometimes not to succumb to the power and charm of his personality and write a biography nonetheless." And Sir Isaiah Berlin, then about 85 or 6 years old and about this tall, grabbed me by the forearm with a strength that was absolutely remarkable. And he said, "Oh, my boy, succumb, succumb." Now, what did Berlin mean by that? He meant, in his view, and his is a view that needs to be respected in these matters, that Roosevelt was such a great world historical personality that would be fully appropriate to tell the story of the mid-20th century through the lens of his biography. He was that consequential in Isaiah Berlin's eyes. So that's the general subject I want to explore with you here this evening, just how consequential was Franklin Roosevelt in the 20th century. Now, let me just say that let me begin by saying that Roosevelt was one of two men, the arcs of whose respective lives trace out the distance between what we might call the highest glories and the darkest evils of the 20th century. And the other man, of course, was Adolf Hitler. They never met, though their lives, as it happened, rather uncannily paralleled one another's, and at last, in World War II, fatefully intersected. They were men of the same generation, bred in the same era, born, in fact, in the same decade, Roosevelt in 1882 and Hitler just 7 years later. And as if in conformity to the plot of a Gothic novel, their lives ended within days of each other. Roosevelt's on April 12, 1945, and Hitler's on April 30th, 1945. And both of them died before seeing to its climax the great war that Hitler had launched and that Roosevelt had struggled to convince his decidedly indifferent, if not outright isolationist countrymen to fight. Each man, Hitler and Roosevelt, had come to power within the span of a few weeks from each other. Hitler was installed as the German Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, and Roosevelt was inaugurated as President of the United States just 35 days later on March 4th. Both, it's to be noted, achieved office by means of democratic elections. Both assumed the leadership of advanced industrial states commonly afflicted by the catastrophe of the Great Depression, which was an economic meltdown of historic proportions that had its heaviest impact in two countries, Germany and the United States. Both Hitler and Roosevelt began their careers as national leaders asking to be judged on their record of success or failure in doing battle against the Depression. And both were ultimately judged on other grounds altogether. The one, Hitler, universally condemned in the history books, and the other, Franklin Roosevelt, almost universally praised and even not infrequently beatified. So I recite the shared history of these two men because I think it's imperative that we understand that all of Roosevelt's presidency, all of it, unfolded under the shadow of Hitler's chancellorship. All of the events that compose the great chapters in Roosevelt's biography and constitute his claim on our historical attention is the drama of the 100 Days, the battle against the Depression, the great social and economic reforms of the New Deal, the struggle against isolationism, the agony of uncertainty about Europe's fate and America's relation to it in 1940 and 41, and of course the waging of World War II itself. All of these episodes played out against the menacing backdrop of Hitler's dictatorship and the looming threat and eventually the shooting armed challenge of Nazism. So Roosevelt's achievements and his failings simply cannot be understood properly outside of that context. Now, if the parallels in these two lives are instructive, I think so are, probably even more so, the contrasts. So let's look back to the spring of 1933. Franklin Roosevelt was coaxing the 100 Days legislation out of the American Congress. He was beginning the long process of wooing the labor unions and the laboring classes upon which he would build the fabled Roosevelt Coalition. And he was finding innovative ways to use the radio to reach beyond what he regarded as the hostile media magnates who controlled the nation's newspapers. Now, in those same months, in the first half of 1933, Hitler was turning the Reichstag into his personal instrument, dissolving the German trade unions and Nazifying the German press. And soon he declared the Nazis the only political party in Germany, and he imposed a reign of terror on the German people, the likes of which this country has mercifully never known. A year later, 1934, while Roosevelt was beginning to worry about a possible political challenge from his potential Democratic senator rival, Huey Long of Louisiana, in that same year, Hitler dispatched his main rival in the Nazi Party, the Sturmabteilung leader Ernst Röhm, by having him summarily executed. The following year, 1935, the year of Social Security, and the Wagner National Labor Act, reforms that ushered millions of Americans into the mainstream of national life, including especially those from the great immigrant communities that had arrived a generation or so earlier. In that same year of 1935, Hitler codified Nazi policies against the Jews in the Nuremberg decrees, stripping them of their citizenship, excluding them from the professions and military service, and prohibiting marriage between Jews and so-called Aryans. So here are the same era, men of the same era, men of the same generation, inhabiting comparably developed Western countries with a largely shared heritage of beliefs and values, facing the identical economic crisis, the Great Depression, but two entirely different responses from two different leaders and two different legacies for their peoples. So those differences tell us volumes, I think, about the historical cultures that produced these two men and about their individual personalities. Now, all personalities, I suppose, are mysterious in the last analysis, often even to their possessors, an insight on which Woody Allen has built a career. And few personalities in our historical canon are more mysterious and challenging to understand than Franklin Roosevelt. Francis Perkins, who is long his collaborator in New York State politics and served for 12 years as his Secretary of Labor, knew him as well as anybody did who worked with him outside of his immediate family. She remained baffled by him to the end. She called him in her memoir, quote, the most complicated human being I ever knew. And many other contemporaries of Roosevelt's famously underestimated him or just outright misunderstood him. So the fabled pundit, newspaper commentator Walter Lippmann, who commanded a voice of authority in the press in those days to which there's nothing comparable today, not even Rush Limbaugh, called him in 1932 called Roosevelt a kind of amiable Boy Scout. And in a column that was destined to become notorious, Lippmann offered his considered opinion of Roosevelt as follows. He said, Franklin D. Roosevelt is a highly impressionable person without a firm grasp of public affairs and without very strong convictions. He is an amiable man with many philanthropic impulses, but he is not the dangerous enemy of anything. He is too eager to please. Franklin Roosevelt is no crusader. He's no tribune of the people. He's no enemy of entrenched privilege. He is a pleasant man who, without any important qualifications for the office, would very much like to be president. Now, that, as I say, was destined to become notorious as a specimen of political misjudgment of a very high order. And yet, perhaps one of the most telling yet somewhat opaque appraisals of all about Roosevelt, surely one of the most succinct, contains not even a predicate, was allegedly delivered by the venerable Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. On the morning of Roosevelt's first inaugural, 1933, he paid a courtesy call to Justice Holmes' home in the District of Columbia. Holmes was then 92 years old. And when, after a little bit of tea and some pleasantries, Roosevelt went on his way to the inauguration, Holmes turned to his law clerk who was there and allegedly said, a second-class intellect, but a first-class temperament. Now, so what was that temperament? What shaped the essence of Roosevelt's character and gave form to the temperament that Holmes remarked on? I want to argue that 4 words can capture most, if not all, of the essence of Roosevelt's character. Absorptive, sunny, self-confident, and responsible. So let's just take them in order. Absorptive. Virtually all of Roosevelt's associates testified about his boundless appetite for knowledge and his remarkable capacity to assimilate it. Adolph Burley, who was one of the original brain trusters that advised Roosevelt in 1932 and after, was just one of many people who were awed by Roosevelt's capacity, the range of his interest and his capacity to take on new knowledge. As Burley put it in his memoir of the New Deal, he said Roosevelt had an almost universal interest. There were few fields of knowledge with which he had not contact, many in which he was expert, but in all he had a vivid interest. Nothing was alien to him. Rexford Tugwell, another one of the original brain trusters, said, Roosevelt could see more in an hour's drive than anyone I have ever known. He noted crops, woodlands, streams, and livestock. To ride with him, said Tugwell, was to be deluged with talk, half practical and half fanciful. Now, as for Roosevelt's disposition, his sunny disposition, his capacity not only to be optimistic, but to project his own optimism to others, the record again overflows with testimonials to how infectious his optimism was. One observer noted that he was all light and no darkness, and the famous literary critic Edmund Wilson said, he is a man of slightly unnatural sunniness. So some people found him just too optimistic for belief. So that sunniness actually had political consequences. When Roosevelt delivered the first of his fireside chats at the end of his first week in office on Sunday evening, March 12, 1933, millions heard the voice of a master showman. And that chat on the radio did as much as any of the preceding week's flurry of legislation to calm the nation's nerves and to win the hearts of his countrymen. And we can actually, to a certain degree at least, quantify this. In the following week, after that initial fireside chat in March of 1933, 450,000 Americans wrote to their new president. And many of their letters at the Hyde Park Library here laboriously penciled in tortured syntax on butchered paper and school pads and one thing or another, the first installment of an avalanche of correspondence that poured into the White House for the next decade and more. The White House mailroom in Herbert Hoover's day, just before Roosevelt came to office, employed a single staffer. But to handle the volume of mail that now came into Roosevelt, the White House increased the staffing of the mailroom to 70 people. And it's just one way to get a numerical handle on just how deeply and effectively Roosevelt was able to project his own personality, his own views and values to the public at large. In fact, it might be said, and here's a kind of a political science note about this, that with the possible exception of his cousin Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's was the first charismatic presidency in which the power of personality, in this case amplified by radio, was self-consciously deployed as an instrument of governance in the age of mass democracy and mass instantaneous communication. Next, self-confidence. It's been said by various observers that Roosevelt's untroubled, in his own mind, his untroubled conception of the office of the presidency consisted quite simply of the image of himself in it. And indeed, his administrations arguably created the benchmark definition of the office for every president who has succeeded him. I'll have more to say about that self-confidence and some of the problems it bred, as well as the virtues that it conferred, in just a moment. But the sources of that faith in himself pose one of the more difficult challenges for Roosevelt's biographers. But the pursuit of answers for that part of his personality brings me to the last matter that I mentioned earlier, the last element of his personality, and that is the notion of responsibility. Much of that sense of duty and responsibility, of patrician obligation, noblesse oblige, if you want to call it that, was instilled by his parents, who doted on their only child. And the theme of noblesse oblige was sternly reinforced by his schooling at Groton, the egregiously Anglophilic nursery of a gaggle of distinguished civil servants in Roosevelt's day, including the Attorney General Francis Biddle, Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles, and later Secretary of State Dean Acheson. Groton was then headed by its legendary headmaster, Endicott Peabody, and Peabody subjected his young pupils to an almost monastic discipline of Spartan living, hard study, and endless imprecations to don the mantle of public service. And later, with typical high Anglican understatement, Peabody later described Franklin Roosevelt as, quote, a quite satisfactory boy. So, under the circumstances of upbringing and schooling, it was all but inevitable that Roosevelt would enter public service. And apparently he never contemplated anything else. And he set out from an early age to trace his distant cousin Theodore Roosevelt's path to the White House, from the New York State Legislature, the New York State Governor's Office, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Vice President, and then President of the United States. And along the way, he further deepened his association with Uncle Teddy, or Cousin Teddy, by marrying Theodore Roosevelt's niece, Eleanor. And at their wedding in New York in 1905, the Reverend Endicott Peabody presided over the nuptials, and then President Theodore Roosevelt gave away the bride. Now, Theodore Roosevelt never voluntarily relinquished the presidency in 1908, and forever after regretted it. It was said of Theodore Roosevelt that he wanted to be the baby at every christening, the bride at every wedding, and the corpse at every funeral. And Franklin Roosevelt took the point. Franklin once said, "No man ever willingly gives up public life. No man who has ever tasted it." And he did not. And he began plotting, or planning, if you want, even after being stricken by polio at the age of 39 in 1921, how to manage his return to political life. An endeavor in which Eleanor served, as it were, as his legs, traveling to main contacts with the Democratic Party around the country. So many people have speculated on the impact of Roosevelt's paralysis on his personality. Here is Eleanor with him, and here is one of the few photographs we have of Roosevelt with the wheelchair showing. So intuition suggests, I suppose, that the shock of such a trauma befalling a vibrant, athletic 39-year-old man must have been transformative in some telling way. But second thought reminds us, at least it reminds me, of the great American psychologist William James' assertion that every person's character is set in plaster by the age of 30. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order, thought that the man the boy would become was evident by age 7. Sigmund Freud set the defining age of personality formation at about 3. And modern geneticists emphasize the biochemical and inherited factors that mold our basic temperaments even while we are still in utero. And indeed, it seems to me that Roosevelt's illness did not so much transform his character as confirm it and deepen it. He faced polio with the same kind of self-assurance and tenacity that his childhood had nurtured and puberty had drilled into him. And in turn, I suppose, coping with polio strengthened but possibly even distorted some of those traits, and I'll come back to that too in just a minute. So like many people with disabilities, Franklin Roosevelt developed a talent for a kind of denial, a forcefully willed optimism that refused to dwell on his difficulties, and it was that same aura of indomitable optimism that he managed to communicate somehow mysteriously to the American people. And in that sense, it might be said that polio served him as a kind of political asset. It gave him a bond of commonality with other people who were afflicted by either personal or physical or financial circumstances. But that same capacity for willing into being the reality he chose to inhabit also, I think, abetted his penchant for duplicity. As, for example, when he continued his love affair with Lucy Mercer, even after he had told Eleanor that it was ended in 1918. And as it happened, as I'm sure most people in this room know, it was Lucy Mercer, not Eleanor, who was at his deathbed in Warm Springs, Georgia, on April 12, 1945. Now, that same sense of robust self-confidence, verging on what the Greeks called hubris, appeared in other chapters of Roosevelt's life as well, notably in the effort to pack the Supreme Court in 1937. But again, I'll come back to that, this capacity of his, or this trait of his, in just a moment. So once elevated to the White House, true to his declaration that no man ever willingly gives up public life, Roosevelt served longer as president than anyone in history. Before or since, there's now a constitutional amendment. So that ensures, unless we change the Constitution yet again, that his re-election 3 times will never happen again. And in yet another demonstration of his capacity, in my view, for willful self-delusion, he also clung to the office of the presidency well after he had lost the physical and mental stamina for the job. In short, he was a politician and nothing else but. With trivial exceptions, he spent his entire adult life either seeking or holding public office. And he was unapologetic in his pursuit of that career path. And it's a reminder of how the standards of that era and the standards of our own are not the same. Now, contrary to much mythology, both then and later, he also had, in my judgment, a coherent view, I stress coherent view, about the purposes of public life and about his own political mission. Most importantly, again, I say this somewhat out of pride of craft as an historian, but I believe he had as well a coherent view of history. He made a shrewd appraisal of the vectors of development that had brought him and his country to their own moment, the country's own moment in time, which he once called a rendezvous with destiny. And he made a no less shrewd appraisal of what the possibilities for change were if the great engines of history could now be compelled to yield if they were skillfully managed. Now, Roosevelt was not alone in trying to make historical sense out of the Depression, and trying to figure how it figured in a larger context of history. Many people in this country and elsewhere saw the crisis of the 30s not simply as another downturn in the business cycle, but as the final operatic, gory climax of a whole era of capitalist energy and expansion. The distinguished British economist John Maynard Keynes reminded Roosevelt of what was at stake in the 1930s in a famous open letter that was published in the New York Times on New Year's Eve, 1933. He said, "You, Mr. President, are the trustee for those in every country who seek to mend the evils of our condition by reasoned experiment within the framework of the existing social system. If you fail, rational change will be gravely prejudiced throughout the world, leaving orthodoxy and revolution to fight it out. Complacent orthodoxy would not do. Reform was essential, and without it, as Keynes said, a moribund but entrenched old regime would be left to contend violently with revolutionaries of the left or the right. Or, as Abraham Lincoln had put a similar proposition in a different context several generations earlier, Lincoln said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, so must we think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we will save our country." Now again, pride of craft is going to show through here once more, but I think knowing when such a moment has arrived, when we must disenthrall ourselves, discard the dogmas of the quiet past, and confront the urgent realities of the present, knowing when such a moment presents itself to us is one of the priceless gifts that the study of history can confer. So disenthrallment, to use Lincoln's word, is what Roosevelt as president set out to accomplish. The result is what history knows as the New Deal, a set of institutional reforms and, I dare say, attitudinal changes about the role of government that have defined the terms of American life ever since. For a long time, since the 30s, in fact, it was commonplace for people to observe that the New Deal had no system. It was a hodgepodge of makeshift policies that added up to no coherent whole. In fact, a writer in the New York Times not many years ago trotted out this tired old proposition once again when he wrote that Roosevelt threw a slew of policies at the wall, and whatever stuck became the New Deal. I think that view is just emphatically mistaken. There was a philosophy, and a coherent philosophy of the New Deal, and its overall achievements, in my view, cohere in a pattern that, in my reading, fairly leaps from the pages of the historical record, and that pattern is so clear that it can be summarized in a single word, and the word is security. So, indeed, I think it's altogether fitting that it's altogether fitting that the emblematic reform of the New Deal, the Social Security Act, bears that word security in its title. Security, taking the risk out of life, reducing people's exposure to what Roosevelt repeatedly called the hazards and vicissitudes of life, was the essence of every major and lasting New Deal reform that reshaped the landscape of American life for subsequent generations. Roosevelt's reforms rendered life more secure for capitalists and consumers, for workers and employers, to corporations and farmers and homeowners and investors and bankers and builders. Job security, life cycle security, financial security, market security, however it might be defined, achieving a measure of security, reducing the risk and uncertainty of everyday life, reducing the risk and the hazards and vicissitudes of life, as he said, was the leitmotif of virtually every one of the New Deal's lasting changes. The fact that we have had nothing resembling the Great Depression since the New Deal, including the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, and certainly nothing resembling the savage cycle of boom and bust that characterized the American economy for a century before the 1930s, all that is compelling proof, it seems to me, of Roosevelt's success in reducing risk throughout the society in all kinds of ways, personal, corporate, and financial. The New Deal, in short, in my view of it, gave to millions of Americans who had never had much of it a sense of security, and with that a sense of having a stake in their country. As Roosevelt himself once put it, we are going to make a country in which no one is left out. And in that simple sentence, Roosevelt summed up much of the New Deal's intent and its accomplishment. Now, before I get carried away in praising the New Deal's success at imparting a measure of security to American life, I want to acknowledge the most conspicuous of the New Deal's failures, and that is that it never ended the Depression. World War II ends the Depression, but not the New Deal. The unemployment rate averaged 17% throughout the decade of the 30s, something we would find unimaginable today, a decade-long worth of 17% unemployment. It never went below 14%, and that was only for a brief period in 1936. And it stood at 15% unemployment as late as 1941. But there is an interesting relationship that I want to try to suggest to you in this mixture of short-term economic failure and long-term political success. And the relationship between the failure to end the Depression and lasting political reform might be illustrated if I call into this conversation somebody who does not usually appear in the same sentence, paragraph, chapter, book, or even library with Franklin Roosevelt, and that's Ronald Reagan. So let's just consider some things for sport to begin with, then we'll get a little more serious. If we look at Reagan and Roosevelt together, we begin with their physical similarities. They were both 6 foot 2 inches tall, and at their fittest in their adult life, they both weighed about 190 pounds. Both reached the White House after serving as governors of the most populous states of their respective eras, New York, in Roosevelt's case, California in Reagan's. Both campaigned on a pledge to resolve what appeared to be the most urgent economic crisis of the moment. That was ending the Depression in the case of Roosevelt and solving the problem of massive deficits in the budget in Reagan's case. Roosevelt named the first woman cabinet secretary, Frances Perkins, and Reagan named the first woman to the Supreme Court, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and both were masters of the highest tech mass communication media of their time, Roosevelt's case, the radio, Reagan's television. And, to return to my original point, both turned short-term economic policy failure into lasting political triumph. And by that I mean this. Reagan failed to balance the budget, spectacularly failed to balance the budget. He and Bush together, Bush Sr. added almost $3 trillion to the federal debt in the 1980s. But that Himalaya of debt overshadowed all dreams of expanding the welfare state for at least the next 2 decades, which was one of Reagan's highest and dearest political objectives. So too, in a similar vein, Roosevelt's failure to end the Depression in a hurry provided him with the indispensable, necessary political space to achieve the lasting reforms of the New Deal, like Social Security, National Labor Relations Act, Fair Labor Standards Act, Securities and Exchange Act, Federal Housing Authority Act, and so on. One test of the logic of the argument I'm trying to urge you to accept is that, just think for a moment, if Roosevelt had somehow in that 100 days in 1933 found the key to end the Depression, would there have been a New Deal as we know it? The answer, I think, is emphatically no. Every one of the great reforms that I just mentioned happens in 1934, 5, or later. So if the economy had been immediately restored to health in 1933, it is at least arguable that politics, too, would have reverted to business as usual, and the United States would not have met its rendezvous with destiny. Now, I might add here, not incidentally, that when Roosevelt spoke as he did so eloquently in his second inaugural address of the 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-nourished, of the millions denied education, recreation, and the opportunity to better their lot and the lot of their children, famous words that echo down the years to us even now, if you carefully, or even with minimum care, read that inaugural address, which you can easily retrieve online, you will discover that contrary to one's intuition, he was not in that passage speaking about the victims of the Depression. He was not speaking about the unemployed. A paragraph or two earlier in that same address, he said that our progress out of the Depression is obvious, and then he went on to say the following: but such symptoms of prosperity may be portents of disaster. Now, that is not the kind of thing you typically hear in presidential addresses, particularly not in inaugural addresses, where the president was bragging about the progress out of the Depression, but warning the country that if we solve this crisis in the near future, our political opportunity will evaporate. And then is when he goes on to talk about the 1/3 of a nation, ill-nourished, ill-clad, so on and so forth. So in his mind, the Depression provided a rare opportunity in a political system designed by the founders in the 18th century to be very difficult to use. That's the system we're constitutionally saddled with. This was a rare crisis in which real change could happen. If it ended too quickly, that opportunity would disappear. Okay, one last comparison with Ronald Reagan. Both men were, in the last analysis, I think, conservatives. I don't need to belabor the point about Reagan, but the term might seem curiously applied to Roosevelt, who was the father of modern American political liberalism, damned in his time as a traitor to his class, and so on. But in the longer light of history, it seems scarcely arguable that Roosevelt was, in fact, no revolutionary. Walter Lippmann got that part right. He was a reformer who conserved and consolidated the capitalist regime of this country by exercising the political instruments of liberal democracy to temper the excesses of swashbuckling, laissez-faire, let-her-rip capitalism, control its abuses, and thereby give it a prolonged lease on life and more political and social legitimacy. Now, some critics have argued that's the rub, that Roosevelt either willfully or unwittingly botched an historic opportunity to slay the capitalist dragon once and for all and usher in the long-awaited collective utopia. The head of the American Socialist Party at the time, Norman Thomas, once put the point this way when he was asked by a presumably right-wing journalist. He said, "Mr. Thomas, isn't it true that the New Deal has carried out the program of the Socialist Party?" And Thomas replied, "Yes, it has, on a stretcher." Meaning Roosevelt done just enough to blunt the really passionate energies of the working class for more drastic reform. That argument, in my mind, has never had much plausibility. And today, even today, as we are entering an era when we're going to re-debate government's role in our economy and society, it seems to me that that view has even less credibility than it ever did. I think it's more responsible to argue that the New Deal tested the leftmost limits of American political culture, and it could not, in any reasonable judgment about the possibilities of that era, have been expected to go beyond those limits. And from that perspective, we might say it's extremely difficult to imagine the New Deal having done more, but it's very easy to imagine it having done less. So in that respect, I think we come back to Isaiah Berlin's point and the importance of that bullet that hit Cermak and not Roosevelt on February 15th, 1933. So time, or rather the lack of time as I look at the clock, prohibits an extensive discussion of Roosevelt's role in World War II, but I want to just say a thing or two about it before I end. And this is, of course, the deck of the ship in Argentia off the coast of Newfoundland where Roosevelt and Churchill met in 1940. Or 1941. So the first point I want to make about Roosevelt in World War II has to do with those crucial months between September 1st, 1939, when the Wehrmacht, the German forces, invaded Poland, and the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. This was a time of huge uncertainty and fearsome uncertainty about, especially after France genuflected to the Nazis in June of 1940, and the question was, would Britain survive? And would the Soviet Union survive after it was invaded in June of 1941? Would the Nazi forces defeat the Red Army in the field or possibly force the British into some kind of a humiliating political settlement with the Nazis? And most urgent of all, of course, in this country, how could the United States manage to put its weight in the scales in favor of those people who were trying to stand up to Nazi aggression? So on May 15th, 1940, the newly installed British Prime Minister Winston Churchill formally asked the American President, Roosevelt, for help in the war against Hitler. So what could or should Roosevelt do? The American people at that point were still decidedly isolationist, something that always gives me pause when I'm tempted to use the phrase greatest generation. And what was more, opinion polls in the summer of 1940 showed that fully 2/3 of Americans who were polled did not believe that Britain would survive. So Roosevelt's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Joseph Kennedy, no relation, cabled him in that period. He said, "Aiding Britain at this hour will leave the United States holding the bag for a war in which the Allies expect to be beaten. If we have to fight in order to protect our lives, we would do better fighting in our own backyard." And that was not an idiosyncratic opinion on the part of Joseph Kennedy. The U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, advised Roosevelt on May 18th, 1940. He said, "We cannot afford to submit ourselves to the delay and consequences involved in accommodating the British government." And just to complicate things further, of course, 1940 was a presidential election year, not the kind of situation that usually stimulates political courage. Yet, in the teeth of all that contrary advice, and despite those circumstances that might have restrained him, Roosevelt, and virtually Roosevelt alone, insisted on diverting American military production to the British, transferring to them 50 World War I era destroyers to aid in the defense of the English Channel, and on revising the neutrality statutes then on the books so as to extend $7 billion in so-called Lend-Lease aid to Britain, and soon thereafter the Soviet Union as well. So here's another episode, a very telling one, in which we see what might be called the virtues of hubris. A less self-confident man might have yielded to his advisors and to the manifest isolation of his countrymen and kept the United States out of the whole affair for the time being. Well, historians, as I said at the outset, by temperament and training, dislike emphasizing the role of the heroic individual in history. We're much more comfortable in my guild with abstractions like the spirit of the times and the vast impersonal forces of history and so on. And I must say I agree with that. That is the way I approach things in my classroom and my research and my writing. But I must also add, this is where I come back to Isaiah Berlin again, that this moment in the 1930s and early 1940s is one moment when it has all been impossible to imagine history taking the course it did without the presence of this man. Okay, one last point about World War II. When it did come time to fight, Roosevelt guided this people, the American people, to victory along what an economist might call the least cost pathway. Absolutely uniquely amongst all the major belligerent nations in World War II, the United States saw its civilian standard of living rise during the war, the origins of a half-century of economic vitality that made the Great Depression a quaint historical memory and defined the secure, affluent world that most, if not all, Americans have lived in for two or three generations thereafter. And while it's true that 405,399 Americans died in military service in World War II, a number I do not mean by any stretch of the imagination to trivialize, those losses, grievous as they were, proportionate to population, were about 1/3 of Britain's and about 1/60th of the Soviet Union's. So small wonder that at the end of the war in 1945, Churchill declared, observing how the United States had engaged the war, what it had suffered compared to others, and where it stood, Churchill said in a speech on the floor of Parliament in August 1945, he said, "The United States at this moment stand," he used the United States as a plural noun, "at the summit of the world." So Germany, meanwhile, at that moment, lay absolutely crushed and defeated. Hitler had brewed a catastrophe for the German people so vast that in German history and memory it seemed to sunder the web of time itself. Germans to this day call the moment of their surrender in 1945 Stunde Null, the 0 hour, when history's clock had come to a fearful halt. So this is Roosevelt's funeral cortege in Washington, D.C. So let's go back to where we began. Adolf Hitler and Franklin Roosevelt left these different legacies to their peoples and to the world. Now, I hope you don't come away thinking I've been here trying to beatify or canonize Roosevelt, but his qualities of intellectual curiosity, optimism, his capacity for conveying optimism to others, his self-confidence, and his deep understanding of history, as well as his willingness to shoulder weighty responsibilities when all around him counseled otherwise, surely shaped his era and our lives deeply. And history must, in the end, I think, credit him with about as close a thing to 3 miracles of leadership as any president can claim. Number 1, wringing lasting and, I would argue, beneficial reform out of the Depression. Number 2, shepherding this reluctant people into what history can only judge on balance to have been a just and necessary war. And third, achieving victory in that war in a manner that sheltered Americans from the worst of its ravages and positioned them for prosperity and international leadership for half a century and more thereafter. As presidencies go, I think that's a pretty impressive record of achievement. And let us just reflect that if that bullet that killed Cermak had been aimed just a degree or two, otherwise this country never would have had its rendezvous with destiny. Thank you. So we have time, I hope, for some questions and comments, and We have microphones, so if you'd like to say something, please wait until the microphone reaches you. I'll leave it to you guys with the microphones to identify.
Any questions?
I see one right in the front here, yeah.
Great talk. I wanted to ask
Boy,
you.
hold that microphone.
Great talk. I wanted to ask you. I believe I had read in the famous historian's H.W. Brand's book, FDR Traitor to His Class, that FDR had originally wanted to be a Republican but decided not to because he didn't want to upstage anything Theodore Roosevelt had done in the Republican Party.
I don't believe that's accurate, but I would yield to better evidence if such there is. As I understand it, the Hyde Park Roosevelts had long been Democrats. The Oyster Bay Roosevelts had long been Republicans, so just as part of his heritage that he became a Democrat, it was natural and organic. That's my understanding of it. Well, he surely admired his cousin, distant cousin, Theodore. That's for sure. But to the best of my knowledge, he was never attempted to join Theodore's political party.
All the way in the back.
Thanks for calling him a conservative because it's long due. When Roosevelt was 7 or 8, 9 years old, he spent summers with his family in Germany. That was Bismarckian Germany. Bismarck had introduced Social Security and several other important social developments for them. Old age pensions, limitations of child labor. Have you considered whether that experience in Bismarck's Germany might have had an influence on Roosevelt's thinking?
I think it surely did, but I think in a sense his thinking along those lines is overdetermined. There were several things, I think, that led him to that kind of a political position. You're quite right that he was reasonably fluent in German. He could understand Hitler's speeches as broadcast over the radio, shortwave. He listened to many of them. So that childhood exposure to that system, I'm sure, was part of it. There's a little bit wonkier dimension to this that you might know, that when he asked Frances Perkins, as Secretary of Labor, to be the political officer overseeing the drafting of the bill that became the Social Security Act, he asked her to put together a body of people, actuaries, statisticians, medical experts, economists, so on and so forth, who would draft the legislation, understanding this wasn't just a short-term relief measure, this was going to be a long-term change in the whole American institutional landscape. And they were also instructed, the head of the committee was an economist from the University of Wisconsin at Madison by the name of Edwin Whitty, and they were specifically instructed to study extant systems in other countries, including Germany. So they were certainly conscious of this as one of the longest established and best functioning systems of this sort, no question about it. Interestingly, since I'm on that note, let me just dilate on my own remarks a little bit. If you read Frances Perkins' memoir, it's called The Roosevelt I Knew. She testifies, she tells us in that memoir how she instructed that committee, the drafting committee, to came up with the legislation that we know as Social Security. And she said one of the things that they had to understand as they began to draft the legislation, I'm going to quote her exactly now, was our legislative habits and the prejudices of our people. She says it right out loud. It's one of the frankest statements you'll ever find, that you cannot devise a perfect Social Security system from scratch. You have to recognize our legislative habits and the prejudices of our people. And the big thing she was getting at there, and Roosevelt himself got at time and time again, was that Social Security, the old age pension part of Social Security, had to be self-financing by employee and employer taxes. There was to be no general treasury revenues that went into Social Security. That's the system we have today still. It's different from almost every other major country's system. And our Social Security, at least the old age pension part of Social Security, is a property right, not a civil right. You don't get it just by being a member of this society. You have to earn it through your employment record. So that's one of the prejudices of our people, the big one that she was talking about.
more of a technical question. When you cited unemployment during the Depression, you made reference 13, 14, 15%. I have heard several accounts from one or another source and read that unemployment was 25%. Why?
You know, you're correct, and I may have misspoken.
Oh.
What I meant to say, and I thought I'd said, but maybe I didn't, was that by the time Roosevelt takes office, 1933, there are 13 million people unemployed. That's the absolute number, and that's 25% of the workforce. Now, as I was discussing with some of the teachers today, we have to think for a minute to understand the full meaning of that 25% for a very simple reason. Then, unlike now, virtually no married women worked. Virtually not, about 9%. Today it's well over 50%. So when we talk about 25% unemployment, for all practical purposes, we're talking about nearly 25% of households who suddenly went without income or a breadwinner. So today, if we had an unemployment rate at that level, God forbid, but if we did, it would not automatically transfer into a comparable percentage of households because most households today have two wage earners in them. So, but 25% is the consensus number. At the time, there was considerable confusion about this. There was no reliable federal system to gather employment and unemployment data. It was one of the things that vexed all efforts in the early stages of the Depression to address this issue. Nobody knew exactly what the scale was. Today, we reconstructed the numbers. We have a pretty good grip on it. Today, of course, we keep track of these things. So 25% unemployment in 1932, or early 33, 13 million people, 13 million households almost, are the consensus numbers.
Hi, I imagine you're
Wait, I
aware
hear you,
of-
but I don't see you.
Oh, am I doing it? Oh.
Oh, okay.
I imagine you're aware of Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine. And it came to mind as you were talking about the fact that if the Depression had not ended, or had ended more quickly, that Roosevelt probably would not have been able to put a lot of his reforms through because the populace would not be in something of a state of shock. And I wonder if there is some way you might relate this to the shocking situation we find ourselves in now.
Well, I'm gonna dodge what I think is the thrust of your question, but I will comment, as I did with people earlier today, about how we might think of the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, as compared with the Great Depression of the 1930s. And my text here that I will cite by way of getting a grip on this is something that the incoming chief of staff-elect, you might say, to Barack Obama, Rahm Emanuel, said just after the election in November of 2008, when he was asked, as he of course would be, that aren't you afraid of assuming power at this time of great crisis? And Rahm Emanuel said, and Obama himself said in in February of 2009 on the Lehrer NewsHour, said essentially the same thing. He said, you never want a crisis to go to waste. Again, as I was saying to people earlier today, I'm told the Chinese character for crisis is a fusion of the characters for danger and opportunity. And again, to repeat something I was saying a minute ago, we have a constitutional system devised by our founders in the late 18th century to make it difficult to exercise power, especially transformative power, from the center. That's the system we have. We've lived with it for more than 2 centuries. Moments of crisis are the only times, essentially, when that system permits truly dramatic change. And you can count on the fingers of one hand, I'd say, the number of times in our history when we've really rearranged institutional life and attitudes in the landscape of collective life in this country, the Civil War and Reconstruction, the New Deal, maybe the 1960s, maybe Ronald Reagan's presidency. Those get a little tougher to deal with. But these are few and far between, and by design. That's the design. So Great Depression lasts a long time. It's very deep. It's a truly, truly scary, frightening, fearsome crisis, and out of that we get a lot of reform, which I think arguably, as I was trying to say earlier, we would not have gotten if things had got back to normal in 1933 or even 1934. Similarly, you get to 2008, 2009, we arrest that downturn fairly quickly. On all kinds of metrics, it doesn't go as deep, and it surely doesn't last as long. We're essentially out of it officially by the end of 2009. And so, you get some transformative change in there. You get the Affordable Care Act, for example. But that is not as transformative in scale or effect, and it certainly isn't as invulnerable or unassailable as the things that come out of the New Deal are. So there's a correlation, it seems to me, between scale of crisis and scale of transformation. So I think that's absolutely a fact of our political life. It has been for 10 or 15 generations.
Do you think enough historians and history has given enough credibility and significance to the importance of the decision of FDR to seek re-election for a third term in 1939 and the effect it had on American history?
Well, in my view, he should not have run in 1944. I mean, he's dead within months. And as I was reminded today, going around the FDR library exhibits, you see photographs of him at the Yalta conference where he comes back from. Oh, no. Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood you. So the question has to do with his third term. You did say that, and I missed it, sorry. No, if I'd been a voter at that time, I probably would have voted for him in 1940. And the polling data that we have, it's fairly reliable, but it's not unassailable, tells us that if France had not surrendered in June of 1940, he probably would not have run again. And even if he had, Wendell Willkie probably would have defeated him if it weren't for the defeat of France that spring. Because people got serious about the fact that this war is going to be a truly big deal. A lot of people in this country were counting on a repeat of World War I when France would stay in the field and contain Nazi expansion. So when France went down, everybody's attitude starts to evolve to the point where we get to Pearl Harbor and substantial unanimity in this country about the necessity of doing this. So I don't think he can be badly faulted for that decision in 1940, but if you get to 1944, I think it's a different story.
Do you believe that Roosevelt's charisma helped to get America out of the Depression? Do you understand?
Yes, yeah. No, I think there's little question about it. This is a difficult thing to nail down with the kind of precision that historians like. But again, I gave you some numbers earlier about this outpouring of spontaneous letter writing to the White House. They had to hire 70 people. There had only been one before to answer random correspondence from citizens to the president. Is some kind of an index of a quantifiable sort of just how he managed to communicate this sentiment about that all we have to fear is fear itself. The future can be brighter. This is a magical gift that some political leaders have and some don't, and he did. So I think psychologically, there's no question, which is why he was so revered at the time by so many people and has been ever since. That communicable, infectious optimism, I think, was really, really politically consequential. So maybe take two more before everybody has to hit the road. So we have one here in front.
Okay.
How about one here and then one? Okay, sorry, I'll take him first. He's got the mic already.
I would agree with you that FDR is a great president, and you mentioned one or two flaws, but two questions. Did he ever have any regrets about what he did in regards to the internment of the Japanese? And number two, in regard to his moment in the sun to change and reform, which is amazing, and I agree with everything you said, did he go as far as he could have gone in the area of race? I know Eleanor was pushing him, you had the Southern Democrats, all that, but did he miss that ball? And did he ever have regrets about the Japanese?
There are two very good questions. They're, in a sense, associated questions. They both have to do with his attitudes toward racial minorities. The record is much denser and thicker on his relations with blacks or his relations with the black community than it is with the Japanese internment issue. As I was discussing today, walking around the splendid exhibit on Japanese internment over here at the library, he really didn't pay an awful lot of attention to the Japanese deal. He accepted the military assessment that there was a security threat, and he got on with it. And the record is very thin that he really deeply engaged in that issue. I think he did not. Now, that's a vexed issue in its own right, to be sure, but you have trouble connecting the dots to him in any very serious way. We have a lot more data about the black situation in the South and people who pressed him at the time to take on more initiative with respect to that. And he essentially consistently answers, as you suggested, that the way that Congress was organized at that time especially, seniority gave people power to a degree that's far less true today. It's not untrue today, but it's less true. And that if he, and because the Southern Democrats were so deeply entrenched, they had seniority, they commanded committee chairmanships in both chambers, that if he really got up their nose too far on the racial issue, they'd start cutting him off the knees and everything else. He'd get nothing accomplished. So it was I have to believe, although I don't know this for an absolute fact, it was a painful but, in his view, necessary political trade-off. There's an interesting exchange with Norman Thomas, quoted a few minutes ago, where Norman Thomas comes back from a fact-finding trip through the South. And he was a pal of Roosevelt's, even though he was a president of the Socialist Party. They were fellow Eastern Brahmins. Norman Thomas was a Princeton graduate, and they kind of had this Ivy League connection. And he comes to see Roosevelt in the Oval Office, and they have this discussion, and Thomas is urging Roosevelt to get out in front of the anti-lynching bill and just do more for blacks in the South. And Roosevelt says, no, for the reasons that I've just been rehearsing with you. And Thomas, you can see in the written record, Thomas is starting to lose his temper about this. And at some point, Roosevelt said to him, look, Norman, I know the South. I know what's going to happen in the South. And we have to be patient. There's change afoot, but it's not going to happen right now. And he said, I'm a better politician than you, Norman, and I know what's going to happen down there eventually. And Thomas said, well, Mr. President, I guess that's why you're sitting on that side of the desk and I'm on this side of the desk. So even Norman Thomas had to recognize that there was a, let's say at a minimum, defensible political logic to what he did or didn't do. Okay, last question.
Don't you look at Roosevelt when he ran in 1944 as his moment of being a true American hero at that point, because he knew he was dying and he wanted it. You had D-Day, you had, it was still the Battle of the Bulge was coming in December. He didn't want to have a change in the whole presidential viewpoint of the war and how it was going to proceed, and also the subsequent dealing with the Soviet Union. And if you look at just watching like the Ken Burns documentary now, you see what Nixon did just after, right before the election with Johnson and going to the South Vietnamese president and the whole thing. So when you look at Roosevelt, what he did, you'd have to think that maybe this was his moment of being a real true American hero by choosing to run, knowing that he was dying, or pretty much that. Realizing his life was in jeopardy.
I can't quite get on board with the word hero there. Psychologically, it's not difficult for me to understand that Roosevelt, having seen the conflict through to that point, wanted to take the victory lap. Who wouldn't? Come on. I mean, that's just human nature. He's struggled through all this stuff, and victory is just around the corner. And who wouldn't want to stay on and take the glory lap for that? So I think in human terms, it's perfectly understandable. But in terms of the responsibilities of leadership at that level, I think it was irresponsible of him to do it, and especially to compound the criticism of him at that moment, he was especially lax in informing his vice president, who was highly likely to take over given his health, about what was going on out there. Harry Truman didn't know about the Manhattan Project until he was about 2 weeks into his presidency, after Roosevelt had died. That's hard to justify as responsible political behavior, although it's humanly understandable, I think, in terms of, as I say, wanting to take the victory lap. But I would withhold the word hero from that. Thank you all very much.